Library Company of Philadelphia, the nation's oldest subscription library and home to many of the works mentioned in the book.
Rosalind Reamer, what is your book, Printers and Men of Capital, about?
It's a book about the beginning of the publishing trade in America. I think that when most of us think about publishers, if we think about them at all, we think of the big publishing houses that we know from our time and from the 19th century. And what I set out to do when I wrote this book was to find those people who were the very beginning of that industry. So I went back into the 18th century and first looked at printers, many of whom became publishers, and found this wonderful transitional group of people who were going to become the precursors to the big business of publishing that we know.
What was the difference at that time between printers and publishers?
Well, a printer was a person who printed a job for someone else. Sometimes they're called job printers. And that means that the expense of the publication was borne by the customer, perhaps, or anyone else who happened to pay for it. It could be borne by the author, as with vanity publishing. And the printer simply printed the book, set the type, pulled the press, didn't even supply the paper in most cases, or if he did, he charged the customer for it directly. So there was no real risk involved in what the printer did. He was, in 18th century terms, a mechanic. And a publisher was someone who took the risk upon himself to produce books for sale. And that meant deciding what to publish. It meant getting perhaps investors, or at least amassing enough credit to be able to produce the book. And there were various ways in which these early publishers did that. But in the end, if the book failed, it was the publisher who paid the price for that.
Take us back to the colonial times, before the Revolution, and in Philadelphia. Who were the printers of Philadelphia?
The printers of Philadelphia were certainly dominated by Benjamin Franklin. He's sort of the prototypical colonial printer.
Why is that?
Well, because he engaged in all the activities that printers at one time or another in the colonial period, and of varying degrees of success, engaged in. So that he printed jobs, he sold books from a store, he imported books from England to resell in the colonies. He also sold all sorts of other things, pictures, ink powder, stationery, goods of all kinds, chocolate, whatever he could get his hands on. So he was sort of like a mini shopkeeper in that sense. Printers tended in the colonial period to diversify their interests because although there was a lot of printing that needed to be done, it didn't necessarily keep food on the table. And so they found other ways to earn a living.
What kinds of things were printed? You used the term job printing. What does that entail?
In the colonial period, most of the printing was not especially elaborate, not big books. And sometimes we tend to think of old books as big tomes, and in fact, about 75% of all colonial printing was pamphlets, broadsides, very small children's books, what are called chapbooks, which are books that could be put in your pocket and traveled with.
What's a broadside?
A broadside is a one-sheet printed piece, like a poster. And in fact, it would be used often as posters to announce an event upcoming, or it could be a political broadside. And so, because it used very little paper in the end, paper was the most expensive part of a printing job. Because it used very little paper, it wasn't, no broadside would break a printer's bank. And they were very popular. Of course, they have a limited time in which they're going to be interesting. In other words, they're ephemeral. And not all that many really survive today, because you can imagine that once they were posted on walls and the like, that they would be torn down. So very few people saved them as they did books.
Was it a lucrative profession?
A lot of printers came and went. A lot of them failed. It was not a profession that made them rich. They tended to be very middling because what they were doing was a mechanic's trade, which they had to have, first had to begin as apprentices and then journeymen and then master printers if they ever got that far. So it was possible to be comfortable and middling as a printer. If you took a little bit more risk, it was possible to do better than that. And Franklin always looked for ways to take risk. He did some pretty large-scale publishing, but he always did it in an informed way. He never took wild chances with the books that he published. So,
how did one get started as a printer?
Often, most printers began as apprentices, and they would be apprenticed to a printer, to a master printer at about 13 years of age. The master printer would house and clothe the apprentice and teach him not only the skills of printing, but also probably how to read and the kinds of basic learning that you would need. Most printers, of course, needed to be literate. On the other hand, there are many stories about printers who couldn't read, and it, in a sense, didn't matter as long as they could set type well. But for the most part, they had to be literate. And after they had apprenticed until they were 18 or 21, depending on the terms of the contract, they would become journeyman printers. And that meant that they could roam around and work for whomever had jobs and be paid wages for that. And this was pretty standard practice for any mechanical trade.
Were they contracted or licensed in any way?
The journeymen?
Right.
They were generally paid by the week. Some journeymen stayed with a master printer all their lives and never became master printers themselves. Some came, did a printing job, and blew out of town and went somewhere else and worked for another printer. And some worked and saved enough money to become master printers themselves, which essentially meant they could be independent. They had their own tools, their own shop,
their own
press. And so the capital needed to become a master printer was pretty significant. And so it is the case that a lot of journeymen simply remain journeyman printers throughout their lives. And they can do reasonably well, but they were never going to become the solid middle-class citizen that the printers tended to be.
What was required to become a printer? What kind of equipment did you need, and how many people would you need to run a shop?
Well, at a minimum, you would need someone who could set type. You would need someone who could pull the press.
Now, setting type at that time were just individual
letters,
pieces of iron.
Right. It was a mixture of metal, antimony and iron and other kinds of things. It was particular because it has to withstand a lot of pressure. When the press is pulled, there's an enormous amount of pressure on that type. And so it can't be a metal that's going to be very soft and that's going to sort of crumble over time, or you won't get a crisp impression. So it was a particular alloy of metals, and it was produced by type founders. Benjamin Franklin's grandson was a type founder trained by Franklin and sent to France to learn the trade of type founding.
That was Benjamin Franklin Bache?
Yes, Benjamin Franklin Bache. And so they would produce type one letter at a time, and setting that type into a form involved very quickly using a composing stick to align the letters and putting the letters in order. They would take them out of little boxes where they knew they could find their A's and they knew they could find their B's and so on. They did this without even looking. And because the cases were always set up the way it's like typing today. We know where the letters are, at least many people do. So they would then set the type using the composing stick, and then that would go into the form, and it would be make sure that everything is straight, and they would lock up the form when the page or pages were set, and then ink the type with ink balls, these big leather balls filled usually with wool, And printing ink was very sticky, so it would stick to the type. It was very tacky. And they would ink the type and then close press and pull the press and get an impression. Normally, it depended on the size of the book that was being published or the format, but for a book like an octavo Shakespeare, they would print 8 pages at a time.
Sounds like a fairly time-consuming process.
It is very time-consuming. And sometimes you find mistakes in the set type, and you have to reset it or try to fix that one letter. Maybe a letter went in backwards. There's certainly lots of examples of that in the colonial printing.
Was the profession exclusively male back in colonial times?
It was only in the sense that no women or girls became apprentices and then learned the trade in the traditional way that boys did. But there were a number of women who either their fathers had died and they stepped into their shoes and became printers, or widows of printers who became printers in their own right. Some other women who did bookbinding, for instance. The most notable woman from this period and well into the 19th century, because she lived a very long life and had a very sort of vigorous business, was Lydia Bailey.
That's this woman right here.
Yes.
In this portrait.
Lydia, her husband Robert Bailey died in the 1790s, and in fact his business had not been especially successful. His father, Francis Bailey, was a very successful Lancaster, Pennsylvania printer. But Robert never quite got the business off the ground. He wasn't the businessman perhaps that his father was. But boy, his wife sure was. She took care of business, and as soon as he died, she took over the business. And we know something about her because she left wonderful accounts of her business and her struggles with her journeymen, and she would record how she felt about these things and what wages she paid them. And you ask about apprentices and journeymen, many of them lived with her, and she actually docked their wages for bad behavior and for laundry, for instance. She would do their laundry, and they had to pay for that. So she was pretty tough, and she ran a very successful printing business.
Was that common, that printing businesses were handed down through a family, through either husband to wife or father to son?
It was very common in the sense that printers, there's a real identification for printers, and I don't know how this is with too many other trades, but it seems that once books and printing are in a family, they have a way of sticking. And so we do have a lot of examples in Philadelphia of colonial printers whose sons go into the business, or who maybe take it in a slightly different direction towards publishing. But generally speaking, sons would not apprentice to their fathers. They wouldn't train formally. They might learn being in the shop, they might learn the trade acting as a clerk, for instance, or selling books. But generally in the colonial period, sons were apprenticed to other people, to other men. It's a way of diversifying your trade, too, because if you're a successful printer, you don't necessarily want your grown-up son to be a successful printer right nearby. And so you would maybe apprentice him out to a watchmaker or a silversmith or something. And so it wasn't standard practice. Having said that, a lot of families do stay in printing for a long time.
1776, about how many printers are there in Philadelphia?
Probably, that's a difficult question to answer in some ways, because there were probably only a handful of serious, regular printers who were printing as a business and putting out regular pamphlets. In case of 1776, you're going to have a lot of political pamphlets dealing with the crisis with England. But there were many, many others, perhaps even dozens, who occasionally just became printers or had something printed as a way to enter into the discourse of the crisis of the moment, but who had no intention of remaining printers. And so the political climate of the Revolution and the period right after the Revolution and into the 1790s was so rich and so tense that a lot of people felt that the only way to get their opinions across was somehow to get involved in the printing trade. And so you have a lot of people who sort of dive into the picture and then disappear. And you have one imprint with them as printer or publisher. And you say, well, what happened to that person? Well, they had something they wanted to say.
They said it.
They said it, and they went out. Or they got in and said, this is a harder business to undertake than I can continue with, and got out. So there are those who stick with it over time, and those are the ones who are the career printers.
1790, the federal government moves from New York City to Philadelphia. How does that change the economy of printing here in this town?
Well, I think it's an important watershed moment, almost more important than the Revolution itself, because with the federal government coming to Philadelphia, first of all, a lot of printers moved into town, especially from New York, where the federal government had been, and they're after government patronage for printing jobs. And it's not only for printing government jobs themselves, but for the patronage and the political patronage associated with getting other jobs. And so you have an influx of printers in the 1790s looking to basically hang on to the coattails of the government. And party strife was so intense, and getting more so over that decade of the 90s, that there were all sorts of opportunities for printers to choose a party and sort of run with it and become the organ for that party's interests.
To what degree, then, what do you think that politics, or if we were to use the term partisan politics, was a catalyst in this town for printers?
I think it was a catalyst, and I think what I argue in my book is maybe a little bit unexpected, and that is that it creates a profession of political publishers. The party politics, the patronage systems where Jefferson is giving one printer his business and Hamilton's giving another his business, and they're giving advice on how to distribute newspapers more broadly so more people can get the Republican message or the Federalist message. In that sense, party politics created a new animal, the political publisher. And these are people like Benjamin Franklin's son, Benjamin Franklin Bache, who was very political. He was a rabid Republican. And he devoted his publishing career to espousing the opinions of Jefferson and his party and to attacking George Washington and the Federalists. And he happened to die in the yellow fever epidemic of 1798, but had he continued, as his one-time partner William Duane did, and who eventually moved to Washington, he would have been today what we consider to be a political journalist, someone whose whole career is about watching politics, writing about politics, and disseminating printed information about politics, or today perhaps on the internet. But what this does in the printing trade is it actually creates a kind of bifurcation, so that you have these political journalists, printers, publishers on one side, and you have those who are sort of steadfastly moving forward to develop the trade of printing and publishing itself, who might be interested in politics, but who've decided they're not going to let it take over what they do from an economic standpoint.
In your book, you write of Benjamin Franklin Bache as he was just beginning this new political printing occupation, that he received a letter from U.S. Senator Robert Morse, who was a powerful senator from New York. And Robert Morse wrote to Bache, quote, "Some of your friends here are rather sorry for your intention of printing a newspaper. There are already too many of them published in Philadelphia, and in these days of scurrility, it is difficult for a press of such reputation as you would choose yours to be to maintain the character of freedom, impartiality, connected with purity." Is that a threat? And if so, what were the consequences of becoming a expressly political printer?
Yes, it's a threat. It's also, I mean, there's no question it was a threat, and it was a threat on political terms. But it's also the elder statesman telling Franklin's grandson, and Franklin carries so much weight and so much importance in Philadelphia. even after he dies, maybe even especially after he dies. And Morris is saying to Bache, if you want to succeed in your chosen trade, and you go off on this political tangent, which is likely to be pretty nasty, then you should think twice about this. Bache does not follow his advice, of course. He, in some opinions, rashly publishes a very explicitly political newspaper, and it gets him into trouble.
What other kind of books were being produced in that period of the 1790s from Philadelphia?
In that period, those who were, as I say, sort of steadfastly following the publishing business itself, mainly what American publishers were trying to do at this point was to replace imports, was to find a way to make it economically feasible to publish books that would normally be sent from England, and to do so more cheaply. Up to this point, it's pretty difficult to publish more economically than books could simply be sent over and sold. And so in order to create an indigenous trade, a domestic American printing trade and publishing trade, they really had to fight the imports. And so what they did is they published a lot of things mostly by non-American authors. So they would get English books and French books and so on, but then they would change something about them.
Was this for copyright considerations?
Well, partly, although the international copyright was completely unenforceable. There's nothing to stop these people from printing whatever and reprinting whatever they wanted to do. But I guess the short answer to your question is that in the 1790s, it was the reprint trade that drove the publishing trade. And they would change, you know, a title page. They would certainly change title page. They would change maybe a preface. They would have an American, say it was a book on botany, an English book on botany. They might have an American botanist write a new preface to the book, and boom, you've got an American book. And it's replaced the original because it's more suited to the American scene. So there was a lot of that going on in the 1790s.
Printers and publishers, as you just said, were struggling to create an indigenous American press. First off, what percentage of the American population at that point was literate?
Well, there's a lot of disagreement about this, and I don't pretend to really have a lot of expertise about it, but it really depended on where, so that it's generally believed that in New England and in the middle states, literacy was very high.
Because of local custom, or why would that be?
Well, I think that probably it's a cultural issue, that learning to read the Bible was extremely important, and once you can read the Bible, you can read anything. It was partly the schools that were developed in New England and the middle states. Southern states definitely had a lower level of literacy. But it's not as if most people who were middle class and above, men and women, would have been able to read and write pretty well.
You brought some examples with you, examples that are kept here at the Library Company of Philadelphia, of work that was published here, I believe, in Philadelphia around the same period.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of work did you bring with you?
I brought I brought some examples of school books and children's books, because I mentioned before that it was just less risky to publish books that were small, that required less paper than these big tomes, and that in the end, everyone needed them. So they're not really publishing books as luxury items.
More pragmatic.
Very pragmatic, very useful. This is a children's book that I like, and that, in fact, is illustrated in my book. This was
a book that taught what? What was the subject of this book?
This isn't actually a school book. It's just a children's book, a toy book, something that a child might get as a premium for doing well in class. Published in 1806 by Jacob Johnson, who was a juvenile publisher. And what I like about this one is there's lots of illustrations or woodcuts. One of the illustrations is actually of the outside of Johnson's bookstore. Great inside advertising.
Awesome.
And it says here, a bookstore in Market Street at which are sold instruction and amusement for children. And so if you're a little kid and you got this book as a prize, maybe for doing well in school, or someone gave it to you, and you read this book, you would certainly be able to identify 147 Market Street, which is where Jacob Johnson's bookstore was. And presumably, if you're walking down the street, you could pull your mother into the bookstore and say, look, I want more of these books.
That raises an interesting question. How did booksellers, printers, or publishers at that time go about advertising their work and then distributing it?
They advertised their books mostly in newspapers. And remember, some of them were printing the newspapers and were the proprietors of those papers, so they were able to use the paper as a way to advertise what they were selling in their shops. But they did also take advertisements, paid advertisements for other booksellers. So even in Benjamin Franklin's newspaper, you'd find ads for other booksellers, too, as you're flipping through. But the most prominent ones would be his ads, and he'd be able to tell you what you could find. They also sometimes published catalogs of books that they had available in their bookstores. They would sometimes publish pamphlets or broadsheets that would go around saying these books can be had, or a recent shipment arrived from England, or newly published by so-and-so. So very much the way they're advertised today, really.
What are some other examples of work that you've brought with you?
This is a book I like because it was designed for a country audience. It's published in Philadelphia.
And what is it?
It's called The Pocket Companion, or Every Man His Own Lawyer. So it teaches you how to write contracts for any given situation: tenant, landlord, employer, employee. And what I like about this is that not only does that, it shows you, it's actually printed in script, so it shows you how to write these contracts physically. In other words, you can practice your handwriting while you're learning to write legal contracts. So it's a very useful book, obviously, to have. It's small, it's portable.
Would this be a book for a city dweller, or maybe somebody living more out in the countryside?
This could be used, obviously, by either, but cities, of course, had lawyers, and people might seek them out to make contracts. But for anyone who wants to do their own contract, whether they're in the city or in the country, they could use this. And its size makes it very portable, so that if you need to go the next town over and do some business and you want to write a contract, you can just take this with you. It's a handy reference guide. So it's kind of a nice book, very useful. There were other books that were used specifically, published specifically for the country. This little book, which actually came in a few volumes, is called Village Sermons. And it's published in Philadelphia by William W. Woodward. And what it is it's enough sermons to last a country village an entire year. So there could be a different one every week, and assuming there's no full-time pastor in that area, that town, that neighborhood, that village, why, someone could get up and take this book out and give the sermon for that week. A lot of the ministers were itinerant, and so they would travel from place to place. Some of them, I'll bet, even had this book too. But when the minister didn't reach your village, you had a perfect reference tool for that. You never had to go without a sermon. And it's also relatively small and portable.
How much would a book like that cost to make? And how much would it cost for the consumer?
A book like that, for the consumer, would probably be 27 cents, 32 cents. These are odd numbers, but it's the way the money worked then. And maybe it would cost 12 cents to produce. And of course, there are economies of scale, so the larger run of a book that you publish, the cheaper you can make each unit.
But
standard economics.
Right.
What happens, of course, is that often they end up with a lot of them left over, remaindered on their hands, and so they end up selling them at discounts, and then
much like today in some ways.
In fact,
books.
The publishing business then really was no different than it is today, because books are a very unique product. Books, unlike shoes or clothing or soap. I mean, books each have an individual life of their own, so that a publisher who publishes 10 different books has 10 different children to look after, has 10 clearly discrete economic investments to manage. And sometimes those books will end up successful, sometimes they'll fail, but what he really is looking for is that one steady selling book that will be his bread and butter. So it's very much like publishing today.
And what's this one?
This is a little book explaining to people in the country how to take care of their horses, Practical Horse Farrier.
Who wrote that book and who printed it?
This was by William Carver, who was a farrier himself, and it was printed by McCarty and Davis in Philadelphia. This edition was 1820, and William Carver, in fact, wrote lots and lots of letters to McCarty and Davis trying to get them to print his book, and he'd send little snippets of his manuscript to try and get them excited. And
Is that much how it worked? In other words, would the author of the book get a percentage of the receipts of the sales of the book, and did they have to shop around their manuscripts?
Some of them shopped them around. There was no set way in which authors would benefit financially from their books. There was a copyright law, but the holders of the copyright tended to be the publishers, not the authors. And so the authors had to usually strike some kind of individualized deal with the publisher. And oftentimes authors would be paid in numbers of copies of the book itself. So they then had to go out and sell them if they wanted to see any actual profit from writing their book.
You have a table in your book talking about this period, this rapid growth. I don't know how much this should be surprising. There's growth of, you have the books listed by genre, devotional books, poetry books, almanacs. Each saw a percentage increase in the number of books demanded. But the largest percentage goes to plays, which saw a 243% increase, and novels, which saw a 343% increase. Is that surprising? Because novels and plays aren't necessarily very pragmatic examples like what we've seen here.
It's true. Well, a lot of historians and literary critics have been looking at this question to try and find out what caused this mushroom of interest in novels and plays. The sale of published plays was driven certainly by the performance of those plays. So if you went to see a play in a local theater, chances are you were going to buy the play if you went to see it and you liked it. So the publication of plays, except for Shakespeare's, but it could even be argued with Shakespeare's, but the publication of plays is really tied to a current event, something that's happening around you in your time. And it's been argued that novels were essentially addictive, that when people began to read them, and it's often believed the primary readers of novels were women, because it takes leisure time to read a novel. It's not especially useful, although many of the novels were very, had lessons and morality tales and so on built into them. But novels became exceedingly popular in the 19th century. It didn't happen quite as early as it did in England. They were novels that were, for the most part, imported from Scotland, from England, from France, but by the 1820s, 30s, 40s, American novelists started to jump in greater numbers, and novels began to lose some of the slight taint that they had. Some people felt that novel reading was dangerous, but at any rate...
In what way?
Well, that it could corrupt the minds of young women reading them, or make them go soft, or take their minds off reality, and that not everyone was convinced that reading was a good thing. So.
You've made the point here and in the book that in this period, federal government in Philadelphia, there's an increasing stratification. In other words, you've said that printers increasingly maybe became the mechanics, the printers, and publishers were a little bit more of the perhaps entrepreneurial side. 1799, 1800, the federal government goes down the road again to Washington. What does that do for the local printing economy in Philadelphia?
Well, strangely, the same thing that happened when the federal government moved from New York to Philadelphia didn't happen when the government moved to Washington. So that some printers followed the government to Washington. William Twain, I mentioned before, had been a partner of Benjamin Franklin Bache, and he was going to go down to Washington, he was going to ride Jefferson's coattails, and he was going to get all sorts of political patronage for publishing. But most didn't. Most, the ones that I studied, stayed in Philadelphia and worked on developing a domestic publishing trade.
And were they successful?
Some of them were extremely successful. Matthew Carey, in the end, was a very successful entrepreneurial publisher who, ironically, made his fortune really on one book, and that is the Bible. He figured out a way to corner the market in every Bible market. So he did small ones and big ones and family ones and church ones, Catholic ones, Protestant ones.
How was that accomplished? How did he go about doing that?
He did that by initially getting enough standing type. He imported type. He bought enough type to be able to have a whole Bible standing.
Standing type.
And that means that the type is all set, and anytime you want to print a new edition, you just print from it. And it takes a lot of room. You need a warehouse, essentially, to keep a lot of type standing. And you need a big printing shop. And most printers in America didn't have enough type to do that with. Normally, they would have to break it up into separate letters again to print something new.
So each new publication, whether it's a book or in some cases a newspaper or other jobs, would have to be broken down,
Absolutely.
the type reassembled.
Yeah, the type would be distributed back to its cases, and the typesetters would once again have to, with a new text, set all new type. So what Carey did is he allowed the Bible to stand once he got enough type, and he could much more quickly than anyone else produce Bibles on demand. He could produce them in small or large numbers, and that's key, because if you produce too many, then you have them sitting on your shelves gathering dust. If you produce just the right amount, it's been a very good investment. And the luxury of having standing type made it possible for him to print any edition size and be more economical that way.
To what degree were these early publishers back in the earliest part of the 19th century, did they carry on in their houses or their publishing imprints, I guess, become established, successful, mainstream? In other words, first off, what happened to Matthew Carey and his publishing operation?
Matthew Carey, in fact, his son did take over his business eventually and have a partner as well. And they lasted for a long time, and eventually in the later 19th century became medical publishers. Lee and Febiger, great medical publishing house in Philadelphia. And Carey became a kind of, sort of a grandfather of the early publishing trade. He was very much a middle class, upper middle class even, gentleman who enjoyed reasonably fine things in life. He had made decisions early to be an entrepreneur and to look out for new ways to sell his products, and he was pretty. He wasn't successful in all the ways he did that, but he was a man of very significant standing. He also was a man of significant opinions, and so he published tracts on political economy and on politics, and a whole tract about Ireland, where he came from. And so he was more than just a tradesman. There's no question.
Was that common, do you think? Is Matthew Carey's story typical?
Well, yes and no. Matthew Carey himself, I think, was probably very unusual, and he was something of a character. What was more typical is that publishers who made the decision early on to take risks in the books that they were going to publish and to form cooperative elements with their peers and to, in some cases, collude, those folks ended up rising in society They no longer, for instance, had their homes where their shops were. They moved to neighborhoods in Philadelphia that were built for townhouses, leaving their shops and sort of behind. One of the things I talk about in the book is the way the neighborhoods change in relation to the printing trade, that publishers eventually really go on to become a kind of bourgeois class, living in separate houses in residential areas, where a lot of the mechanic printers who continued to print job printing for those publishers, for the most part, they often lived above their shops or right next door, and so they were still kind of in the hustle-bustle of the trade area parts of town. And you can see that. You can see it physically changing by using city directories and newspapers and the like.
And is what happened in Philadelphia, do you think, typical of what happened elsewhere in the country? Cities like New York, Boston, publishing centers?
Yeah, I think it probably was fairly typical. There are fine distinctions between the major cities in which publishing was happening.
You trace in your book up to about the 1840s or so, and you start citing names like a Boston publisher, George Palmer Putnam, which is a name that is familiar probably to many readers today. Putnam is quoted as saying he likes, in that time, this go-ahead sort of spirit of the publishing and printing industry. And you name others. New York became dominated by John Wiley, the Harper Brothers, Henry Charles Carey, Eliot, Lippincott. Other cities, for example, Boston, Ticknor and Fields, Houghton Mifflin, Little Brown and Company. These are companies that are still with us in one form or another today.
It's likely that readers of my book will only recognize names, other than Benjamin Franklin's perhaps, they'll only recognize names when they get to the end of the book, because those are the people who are going to become the big publishers, the big publishing houses that we have heard of today, that we see on the spines of books that we get from the library and buy in stores. And they were a different breed, and I guess what I'm trying to argue in this book is that the Matthew Careys and the Benjamin Franklin Baches and the McCarty and Davises, that these lesser-known firms were really the sort of transitional group that took the trade from mechanical printer tradesmen to entrepreneurial middle-class publisher, risk-taking entrepreneur. So I think that it's true. When you finally arrive at that part of the book and you say, oh, these publishers, I know who these people are, they're the ones who survived. And largely, and by the way, Henry Carey was Matthew's son, but most of these publishers were in New York. The Philadelphia publishing trade continued in a sort of specialized way, as in Lee and Febiger with medical publishing and Lippincott. But the New York trade really did overtake Philadelphia by the middle of the 19th century.
Do you have any printers or publishers in your family background?
Well, no. My brother is what you might call a hobby printer. He collects presses and develops new techniques of printing and using digitalization and so on. But I don't have any real tie to printing.
What drew you to this topic?
I'm laughing because I think that I don't know what drives people to topics, and I'm always amazed and impressed when someone goes into the archives ready to do research, knows what they're looking for and expects to find. I was looking to study printers as a way to understand political ideology in the New Republic. I ended up not finding anything very interesting about printers and political ideology in the New Republic. Instead, what I found was their business papers, their letters to each other, accounts, and I became fascinated by these sort of remnants of a business culture that we could maybe try to bring back to life a little bit. And so I went from being maybe a political historian to a business historian overnight, just because the records led me there. And I think that's probably not a very nice thing to admit, because most people like to say, well, you know, this is what I was going to look for and here's what I found. But the fact is it brought me to a different place. It brought me to an appreciation of their day-to-day decisions, of how they took the risks they took, what happened when they went bankrupt. The printing trade and publishing trade, it was like a house of cards. When one of them would go down, they would almost all fail, because they were supporting each other in various complicated credit ways. So I found that story more compelling than the one I had started out looking for. And the records were there to help me tell the story, and that's what I came up with.
And how did you find the experience of writing the book and then working with publishers and printers to produce it?
There was very little, I guess I would say there was very little that related the two in my mind. And it's not necessarily because the experience of what we did to create my book was so different from the experience of what the publishers I studied did. But academic publishing today is an industry of its own, and I had an extremely accomplished editor at University of Pennsylvania Press who went through every word and made sure that I was being as clear as I could be. The only area where I think I might have had any of those sort of moments that an author and a publisher might have is over the design, which I ended up thinking was quite nice. But one thing that concerned me was that the typeface used on the front cover was a very swirly, scripty typeface, which to me looks more like handwriting than printing. And then we have a little printing press on the bottom of the cover to show that this is about printing. So I simply raised the question, shouldn't there be more of a traditional printed type font on the front? And the designer was convinced otherwise, and in fact I think he made the right choice. But it was one of those typical author-publisher moments, I think.
It was published in 1996 by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Is it still in print?
It still is.
And do you have another book that you're working on at this point?
Actually, this book led me to think about my second book. And that is going to be a study of the development of entrepreneurial culture and business culture in New York and Philadelphia, not using publishers or the printing trade exclusively, and maybe not at all. But one of the things I found out from this research is that a lot of New York publishers at the time seemed more willing to extend long credits and credit to people they never had met, and to get out into the hinterland and sell books a little bit more aggressively than the Philadelphia publishers. And I kept reading letters about, oh, those New Yorkers, they're giving long credits that we can't match. And I started thinking, gee, I wonder, we all know that New York became the center of book publishing in America. I wonder if there isn't a reason, because maybe New Yorkers are looking at business and risk differently. I mean, maybe there are different attitudes about risk, about things like insurance, about credit, about how credit networks are extended. Do you just extend credit to people you either know or that someone else you know knows? So I don't know. It's a little bit of a hunch, and I've done some of the secondary reading, and it might help us understand more about New York's meteoric rise in the world of business. And